chapter before, Sweetheart of the Song Trebong, and we're reading a couple of smaller chapters today. This is called The Dentist. When Kurt Lemon was killed, I found it hard to mourn. I knew him only slightly, and what I did know was not impressive. He had a tendency to play the tough soldier role, always posturing, always puffing himself up, and on occasion he took it way too far. It's true that he pulled off some dangerous stunts, even a few that seemed plain crazy, like the time he painted up on his body and put on a ghost mask and went out trick-or-treating on Halloween. But afterwards, he couldn't stop bragging. He kept replaying his own exploits, tackling on little flourishes that never happened. He had an opinion of himself, I think, that was too high for his own good. Or maybe it was the reverse. Maybe it was his low opinion that he kept trying to erase. In any case, it's easy to get sentimental about the dead. And to guard against that, I want to tell a quick Kurt Lemon story. In February, we were working in an area of operations called the Rocket Pocket, which got its name from the fact the enemy sometimes used the place to launch rocket attacks on the airfield at Chulai. But for us, it was like a 2-week vacation. The AO lay along the South China Sea, where things had the feel of a resort, with white beaches and plain trees and friendly little villages. It was a quiet time. No casualties, no contact at all. As usual, though, the higher-ups couldn't leave well enough alone, and one afternoon an Army dentist was choppered in to check our teeth and do minor repair work. He was a tall, skinny young captain with bad breath, and for half an hour he lectured us on oral hygiene, demonstrating the proper flossing and brushing techniques. Then afterward he opened up shop in a small field tent, and we all took turns going in for personal exams. At best, it was a very primitive setup. There was a battery-powered drill, a canvas cot, a bucket of seawater for rinsing, a metal suitcase full of the various instruments. It amounted to an assembly line dentistry, quick and impersonal, and the young captain's main concern seemed to be the clock. And as we sat waiting, Kurt Lemon began to tense up. He kept fidgeting, playing with his dog tags. Finally, somebody asked what the problem was, and Lemon looked down at his hands and said back in high school he'd had a couple of bad experiences with dentists. Real sadism, he said, torture chamber stuff. He didn't mind blood or pain. He actually enjoyed combat. But there was something about a dentist that just gave him the creeps. He glanced over at the field tent and said, "No way. Count me out. Nobody misses with these teeth." But a few minutes later, when the dentist called his name, Lemon stood up and walked into the tent. It was over fast. He fainted before the man touched him. 4 of us had to hoist him up and lay him on the cot. When he came to, there was a funny new look on his face, almost sheepish, as if he'd been caught committing some terrible crime. He wouldn't talk to anyone. For the rest of the day, he just stared off by himself, sitting alone under a tree, just staring down at the field tent. He seemed a little dazed. Now and then we could hear him cussing, bawling himself out. Anyone else would have laughed it off, but for Kurt Lemon it was too much. The embarrassment must have turned a screw in his head. Late that night, he crept down to the dental tent. He switched on a flashlight, woke up the young captain, and said he had a monster toothache. A killer, he said, like a nail in his jaw. The dentist couldn't find any problem, but Lemon kept insisting. So the man finally shrugged and shot in the Novocaine and yanked out a perfectly good tooth. There was some pain, no doubt, but in the morning, Kurt Lemon was all smiles. All right. So Lemon was afraid that his reputation as a tough guy would be ruined because he fainted going into the dentist. So he had the guy pull a good tooth. And Lemon's the one, remember, in the chapter before that he stepped on a mine and he was blown into a tree and had to pick the pieces out of the tree. So now we're skipping Sweetheart of the Song Trebong because we already did that. There's a video on that very close to here. And we're skipping to page 111. Cam, turn to page 111, please. And this is very short. It's called Stockings. Remember we talked about good luck charms and the things the guys have with them. And this is all about Henry Dobbins' stockings. Henry Dobbins was a good man and a superb soldier, but sophistication was not his strong suit. The ironies went beyond him. In many ways, he was like America itself, big and strong, full of good intentions, a roll of fat jiggling at his belly, slow of foot but always plodding along, always there when you needed him, a believer in the virtues of simplicity and directness and hard labor. Like his country, too, Dobbins was drawn toward sentimentality. Even now, 20 years later, I can see him wrapping his girlfriend's pantyhose around his neck before heading out on ambush. It was his one eccentricity. The pantyhose, he said, had the properties of a good luck charm. He liked putting his nose into the nylon and breathing in the scent of his girlfriend's body. He liked the memories this inspired. He sometimes slept with the stockings up against his face, The Wayne infant sleeps with a flannel blanket, secure and peaceful. More than anything, though, the stockings were a talisman for him, which is like a good luck charm. They kept him safe. They gave access to a spiritual world where things were soft and intimate, a place where he might someday take his girlfriend to live. Like many of us in Vietnam, Dobbins felt the pull of superstition, and he believed firmly and absolutely in the protective power of the stockings. They were like body armor, he thought. Whenever we sailed up for late-night ambush, putting on our helmets and flak jackets, Henry Dobbins would make a ritual out of arranging the nylons around his neck, carefully tying a knot, draping the two-leg sections over his left shoulder. There were some jokes, of course, but we came to appreciate the mystery of it all. Dobbins was invulnerable. Never wounded, never a scratch. In August, he tripped a bouncing Betty, which failed to detonate. After a week later, he got caught in the open during a fierce little firefight. No cover at all, but he just slipped the pantyhose over his nose and breathed deep and let the magic do its work. It turned us into a platoon of believers. You don't dispute facts. But then near the end of October, his girlfriend dumped him. It was a hard blow. Dobbins went quiet for a while, staring down at her letter. Then after a time he took out the stockings and tied them around his neck as a comforter. No sweat, he said. The magic doesn't go away. Now the next small chapter is called Church. It starts on 113. You got to think about that old quote from World War II, there's no atheists in foxholes. If you're fighting, if you're at risk, odds are you're worshiping something, some type of God. And that comes up a little bit in this chapter. Remember, and we're also remember, the truth and the reality are still really blurred with this. We don't know what's true and what's not with O'Brien anymore. One afternoon, somewhere west of the Batangan Peninsula, we came across an abandoned pagoda. Or almost abandoned, because a pair of monks lived there in a tar paper shack, tending a small garden and some broken shrines. They spoke almost no English at all. When we dug our foxholes in the yard, the monks did not seem upset or displeased, though the younger one performed a washing motion with his hands. No one could decide what it meant. The older monk led us into the pagoda. The place was dark and cool, I remember, with crumbling walls and sandbag windows and a ceiling full of holes. It's bad news, Kiowa said. You don't mess with churches. But we spent the night there, turning the pagoda into a little fortress. And then for the next 7 or 8 days, we used the place as a base of operations. It was mostly a very peaceful time. Each morning, the 2 monks brought us buckets of water. They giggled when we stripped down to bathe. They smiled happily when we soaped up and splashed one another. And on the second day, the older monk carried in a cane chair for the use of Lieutenant Jimmy Cross, placing it near the altar area, bowing and gesturing for him to sit down. The old monk seemed proud of the chair, and proud that such a man as Lieutenant Cross should be sitting in it. On another occasion, the younger monk presented us with 4 ripe watermelons from his garden. He stood watching until the watermelons were eaten down to the rinds. Then he smiled and made that strange washing motion with his hands. Though they were kind to all of us, the monks took a special liking for Henry Dobbins. Soldier Jesus, they'd say. Good soldier Jesus. Squatting quietly in the cool pagoda, they would help Dobbins disassemble and clean his machine gun, carefully brushing the parts with oil. The 3 of them seemed to have an understanding, nothing in words, just a quietness they shared. You know, Dobbins said to Kiowa this morning, after the war, maybe I'll join up with these guys. Join how? Kiowa said. Wear robes? Take the pledge? Kiowa thought about it. That's a new one. I didn't know you were all that religious. Well, I'm not, Dobbins said. Beside him, the 2 monks were working on the M60. He watched them take 2 turns running oiled swabs through the barrel. I mean, I'm not the churchy type. When I was a little kid, way back, I used to sit there on Sunday morning counting bricks in the wall. Church wasn't for me. But then in high school, I started to think how I'd like to be a minister. Free house, free car, lots of potlucks. It looked like a pretty good life. You're serious, Kiowa said. Dobbins shrugged his shoulders. What's serious? I was a kid. The thing is, I believed in God and all that, but it wasn't the religious part that interested me. Just being nice to people, that's all. Being decent. Right, Kiowa said. visit sick people, stuff like that. I would have been good at it too. Not the brainy part, not sermons and all that. But I'd be okay with the people part. Henry Dobbins was silent for a time. He smiled at the older monk, who was now cleaning the machine gun's trigger assembly. But anyway, Dobbins said, I could never be a real minister, because you have to be super sharp. Upstairs, I mean. It takes brains. You have to explain some hard stuff, like why people die, or why God invented pneumonia, and all that. He shook his head. I just didn't have the smarts for it. And there's the religious thing, too. All these years, man, I still hate church. Maybe you'd change, Kiowa said. Henry Dobbins closed his eyes briefly, then laughed. One thing for sure, I'd look spiffy in those robes they wear, just like Friar Tuck. I'll do it. Find a monastery somewhere. Wear a robe and be nice to people. Sounds good, Kiowa said. The two monks were quiet as they cleaned and oiled the machine gun. Though they spoke almost no English, they seemed to have great respect for the conversation, as if sensing important matters were being discussed. The younger monk used a yellow cloth to wipe dirt from a belt of ammunition. What about you? Dobbins said. How? Well, you carry that Bible everywhere. You never hardly swear or anything, so you must. I grew up that way, Kiowa said. Did you ever think about being a minister? No, not ever. Dobbins laughed. An Indian preacher. Man, that's one I'd love to see. Feathers and buffalo robes. Kiowa lay on his back, looking up at the ceiling, and for a time he didn't speak. Then he sat up and took a drink from his canteen. Not a minister, he said. But I do like churches, the way it feels inside. It feels good when you just sit there like you're in a forest. And everything's really quiet, except there's still this sound you can't hear. Yeah. Ever feel like that? Sort of. Kiowa made a noise in his throat. This is all wrong, he said. What? Setting up here. It's wrong. I don't care what. It's still a church. Dobbins nodded. True. A church, Kiowa said. Just wrong. When the two monks finished cleaning their machine gun, Henry Dobbins began reassembling it, wiping off the excess oil. Then he handed each of them a can of peaches and a chocolate bar. Okay, he said. Dee Mao, boys, beat it. The monks bowed and moved out of the pagoda into the bright morning sunlight. Henry Dobbins made the washing motion with his hands. You're right, he said. All you can do is be nice. Treat them decent, you know? So now this one's a little more serious. This is called The Man I Killed, and this goes back to Tim O'Brien and someone that he believes was killed as a result of something he did. And throughout this chapter, he talks to us. He's the narrator, but Keo was there with him, and he doesn't talk to him. It's like he's stunned, and he's staring at this body, and he can't move on for a long time. So there's a lot of details in here about the guy, about the deceased, the Viet Cong that was killed by Tim. And a lot of these details, there's no way that Tim could know them. So that's where we're getting into the whole fictional aspect. He's constructing a backstory for his victim, for his kill here. And is this something that most people would do? I don't know. I was never in this situation, but that's what this is. It's not like he interviewed the family and knew what happened. He's making up a backstory. His jaw was in his throat. His upper lip and teeth were gone. His one eye was shut. His other eye was a star-shaped hole. His eyebrows were thin and arched like a woman's. His nose was undamaged. There was a slight tear at the lobe of one ear. His clean black hair was swept upward into a cowlick at the rear of the skull. His forehead was slightly freckled. His fingernails were clean. The skin at his left cheek was peeled back in 3 ragged strips. His right cheek was smooth and hairless. There was a butterfly on his chin. His neck was open to the spinal cord, and the blood there was thick and shiny, and it was this wound that had killed him. He lay face up in the center of the trail, a slim, dead, almost dainty young man. He had bony legs, a narrow waist, long, shapely fingers. His chest was sunken and poorly muscled, a scholar maybe. His wrists were the wrists of a child. He wore a black shirt, black pajama pants, a gray ammunition belt, a gold ring on the 3rd finger of his right hand. His rubber sandals had been blown off. One lay beside him, the other a few meters up the trail. He'd been born, maybe, in 1946 in the village of Maikee near the central coastline of Quang Ngai province, where his parents farmed and where his family had lived for several centuries, and where during the time of the French, his father and two uncles and many neighbors had joined in the struggle for independence. He was not a communist. He was a citizen and a soldier. In the village of Maikee, as in all of Quang Ngai, patriotic resistance had the form of tradition, which was partly the force of legend, and from his earliest boyhood, the man I killed would have listened to stories about the heroic Trung sisters and Trung Hung Do's famous rout of the Mongols and Li Loi's final victory against the Chinese at Tat Dong. He would have been taught that to defend the land was the man's highest duty and highest privilege. He'd accepted this. It was never open to question. Secretly, though, it also frightened him. He was not a fighter. His health was poor, his body small and frail. He liked books. He wanted someday to be a teacher of mathematics. At night, lying on his mat, he could not picture himself doing the brave things that his father had done, or his uncles, or the heroes of the stories. He hoped in his heart he would never be tested. He hoped the Americans would go away. Soon, he hoped. He kept hoping and hoping, always, even when he was asleep. "Oh man, you effing trashed the effer," Ezra said. "You scrambled his sorry self. Look, you did. You laid him out like shredded effing wheat." "Go away," Kiowa said. "I'm just saying the truth, like oatmeal." "Go," Kiowa said. "Okay, then I take it back," Ezra said. He started to move away, then stopped and said, "Rice Krispies, you know? On the dead test, this particular individual gets an A+. Smiling at this, he shrugged and walked up the trail toward the village behind the trees. Kiowa kneeled down. "Just forget that crud," he said. He opened up his canteen and held it out for a while, then sighed and pulled it away. "No sweat, man. What else could you do?" Later, Kiowa said, "I'm serious. Nothing anybody could do. Come on. Stop staring." The trail junction was shaded by a row of trees and tall brush. The slim young man lay with his legs in the shade. His jaw was in his throat. His one eye was shut, and the other was a star-shaped hole. Kiowa glanced at the body. "All right, let me ask a question," he said. "You want to trade places with him? Turn it all upside down. You want that? I mean, be honest." The star-shaped hole was red and yellow. The yellow part seemed to be getting wider, spreading out at the center of the star. The upper lip and gum and teeth were gone. The man's head was cocked at a wrong angle, as if loose on the neck, and the neck was wet with blood. "Think it over," Kiowa said. Then later he said, "Tim, it's a war. The guy wasn't Heidi. He had a weapon, right? It's a tough thing for sure, but you've got to cut out that staring." Then he said, "Maybe you better lie down for a minute." And then after a long, empty time, he said, "Take it slow. Just go wherever the spirit takes you." The butterfly was making its way along the young man's forehead, which was spotted with small dark freckles. The nose was undamaged. The skin on the right cheek was smooth and fine-grained and hairless, frail-looking, delicately boned. The young man would not have wanted to be a soldier, and in his heart he would have feared performing badly in battle. Even as a boy growing up in the village of Maikee, he'd often worried about this. He imagined covering his head and lying in a deep hole and closing his eyes and not moving until the war was over. He had no stomach for violence. He loved mathematics. His eyebrows were thin and arched like a woman's, and at school the boys sometimes teased him about how pretty he was. The arched eyebrows and the long, shapely fingers, and on the playground they mimicked a woman's walk and made fun of his smooth skin and his love for mathematics. The young man could not make himself fight them. He often wanted to, but he was afraid, and this increased his shame. If he could not fight little boys, he thought, how could he ever become a soldier and fight the Americans, with their airplanes and helicopters and bombs? It did not seem possible. In the presence of his father and uncles, he pretended to look forward to doing his patriotic duty, which was also a privilege. But at night he prayed with his mother that the war might end soon. Beyond anything else, he was afraid of disgracing himself, and therefore his family and village. But all he could do, he thought, was wait and pray and try not to grow up too fast. "Listen to me," Kiowa said. "You feel terrible. I know that." Then he said, "Okay, maybe I don't know." Along the trail there were small blue flowers shaped like bells. The young man's head was wrenched sideways, not quite facing the flowers, and even in the shade a single blade of sunlight sparkled against the buckle of his ammunition belt. The left cheek was peeled back in 3 ragged strips. The wounds at his neck had not yet clotted, which made him seem animate even in death, the blood still spreading out across his shirt. Kiowa shook his head. There was some silence before he said, "Stop staring." The young man's fingernails were clean. There was a slight tear at the lobe of one ear, a sprinkling of blood on the forearm. He wore a gold ring on the 3rd finger of his right hand. His chest was sunken and poorly muscled, a scholar maybe. His life was now a constellation of possibilities. So yes, maybe a scholar. And for years, despite his family poverty, the man I killed would have been determined to continue his education in mathematics. The means for this were arranged, perhaps, through the village liberation cadres, and in 1964, the young man began attending classes at the university in Saigon, where he avoided politics and paid attention to the problems of calculus. He devoted himself to his studies. He spent his nights alone, wrote romantic poems in his journal, took pleasure in the grace and beauty of different equations. The war, he knew, would finally take him. But for the time being, he would not let himself think about it. He'd stop praying. Instead, now, he waited. And as he waited in his final year at university, he fell in love with a classmate, a girl of 17, who one day told him his wrists were like the wrists of a child, so small and delicate, and who admired his narrow waist and the cowlick that rose up like a bird's tail at the back of his head. She liked his quiet manner. She laughed at his freckles and bony legs. One evening, perhaps, they exchanged gold rings. Now when I was a star. "You okay?" Kiowa said. Corpse lay almost entirely in shade. There were gnats at the mouth, little flecks of pollen drifting along the nose. The butterfly was gone. The bleeding had stopped except for the neck wounds. Kiowa picked up the rubber sandals, clapping off the dirt, then bent down to search the body. He found a pouch of rice, a comb, a fingernail clipper, a few soiled piasters, a snapshot of a young woman standing in front of a parked motorcycle. Kiowa placed these items in his rucksack along with the gray ammunition belt and rubber sandals. Then he squatted down. "I'll tell you the straight truth," he said. "The guy was dead the second he stepped on the trail. Understand me? We all had him zeroed. A good kill. Weapon, ammunition, everything." Tiny beads of sweat glistened at Kiowa's forehead. His eyes moved from the sky to the dead man's body to the knuckles of his own hands. "So listen. You best pull your shit together. Can't sit here all day." Later he said, "Understand?" Then he said, 5 minutes, Tim. 5 more minutes and we're moving out." The one eye did a funny twinkling trick, red to yellow. His head was wrenched sideways, as if loose at the neck, and the dead young man seemed to be staring at some distant object beyond the bell-shaped flowers along the trail. The blood at the neck had gone to a deep purplish black. Clean fingernails, clean hair. He'd been only a soldier for only a single day. After his years at the university, the man I killed returned with his new wife to the village of Maikee, where he enlisted as a common rifleman with the 48th Viet Cong Battalion. He knew he would die quickly. He knew he would see a flash of light. He knew he would fall dead and wake up in the stories of his village and his people. Kiowa covered the body with a poncho. "Hey, you're looking better," he said. "No doubt about it. All you needed was time. Some mental R&R. Then he said, "Man, I'm sorry." Then later he said, "Why not talk about it?" Then he said, "Come on, man. Talk." He was a slim, dead, almost dainty young man of about 20. He lay with one leg bent beneath him, his jaw in his throat, his face neither expressive nor inexpressive. One eye was shut, and the other eye was a star-shaped hole. "Talk," Kiowa said. All right, that's our reading for today, which is Monday the 8th for green and Tuesday the 9th for gold. So make sure you have this done before we come in on the 11th and 12th for the next session for this week. So that's it.